here since 1995. For those of you who weren't here for our opening remarks yesterday, the Liberty and Law Center is a center at the Scalia Law School dedicated to individual rights, individual freedom, the rule of law, and freedom of speech. And we, among other things that we do, is we host occasional academic conferences of this sort on topics related to individual liberty. I wanted to take the opportunity to thank Professor Alvarez for helping to organize, or doing much of the work to organize the academic aspects of this conference, and to thank Joanne Koob of the Liberty and Law Center for her work, and the staff of the Liberty and Law Center for all their work, and also to thank the John Templeton Foundation for providing the funding for this conference. We have another series of interesting panels this morning. Some of the views that will be expressed here are undoubtedly going to be controversial. At some schools these days, that will be a problem. Here at the Scalia Law School, we welcome diverse views, and we welcome open debate, and we are committed, and hopefully will stay committed to open discourse and debate. And with that, let me turn it over to Joanne to moderate this panel.
Good morning, everybody. I have the pleasure of moderating this first panel we have this morning. So I'm going to do very quick introductions of the panelists, because you can read more about them in our program. So I'll start with Mark DiGirolamo, who is the Carey Fields Professor of Law and the co-director of the Center for Law and Religion at St. John's Law School. He'll be presenting his paper entitled The New Disestablishments. Frederick Geddix is the Guy Anderson Chair and Professor of Law at Brigham Young University Law School. Professor Geddix will be commenting on Professor DiGirolamo's paper. Stephen Smith is the Herzog Endowed Scholar, Warren Distinguished Professor of Law, co-executive director of the Institute for Law and Religion, and co-executive director of the Institute for Law and Philosophy at the University of San Diego, so he holds just a few roles. Professor Smith will be discussing his paper, The Church in the Twilight. And finally, immediately to my right is Andrew Graham, who serves as Senior Counsel for Academic and Professional Affairs at Alliance Defending Freedom. And Mr. Graham will be commenting on Professor Smith's paper. So we'll start with you, Professor DiGirolamo.
Okay, great. And I can do it from here, Sakub, right? Okay, great. So I first want to thank Helen Alvarez very, very much for thinking of me for this project. She's a terrific person that I know and remember now. It's getting on to be a few years. The first time we met, we shared a cab. I remember coming back from one conference or another, and since then, I've always thought, boy, that's really a person I'd like to collaborate with. So I'm delighted to be here, and also to George Mason Law School and the Liberty and Law Center for hosting this conference and inviting me. So the title of my piece, as Professor Koob mentioned, is The New Disestablishments. It describes what I see as the current legal and social dynamics of establishment, free exercise, and disestablishment in America today. It's a core claim of the paper that to understand those dynamics is not to try to understand what religion is or what secularism is. Instead, I argue that it would be better to begin by focusing on the word establishment. What is an establishment? An establishment is what classical political writers call a regime, a set of norms and laws that reflect the highest collective projects and ends to which a community is committed and that bind its members. The establishment is the orthodoxy of that political community as manifested in its public institutions. But to be an effective establishment, it will need to penetrate deeper than that. It will form and habituate people to accept it and then eventually to embrace it in their private lives. Now, in America, for many decades, the establishment could be described as diffusely Christian. It wasn't formally recognized, but that certainly did not diminish its power as a unifying set of constitutive assumptions. School prayer, religious displays, state-sponsored references to God, legislative military chaplaincies, tax-exempt status for religious organizations, the calendar, its Sabbath day, public holidays, and on These and many more are features of what the paper calls the old establishment. And not only public institutions of the kind I just mentioned, but also private groups and associations relied on this establishment in forming and pursuing their projects in coordination with and often supported by the state. Families are an example, religious organizations, hospitals. What happened to this American establishment? Well, it was dismantled, it was de-regimified, it was disestablished, in part by the Supreme Court, but in part by other forces, with the result that this old establishment is now largely gone. And its demise can be sensed by surveying the kinds of cases that have been brought over the last decade and more, making claims of free exercise. Virtually every single high-profile case, at least since 2010, has featured a Christian claimant. Christian Legal Society, Hosanna Tabor, Hobby Lobby, Little Sisters of the Poor, Masterpiece Cake Shop, Catholic Social Services, the plaintiffs in the recent ministerial exception cases, and on, all Christian. How to explain this overwhelming overrepresentation? Well, what explains it is the coming of a new establishment that presents problems for these claimants. These claimants are the losers in the intensifying sub-constitutional culture wars brought on by the new establishment. What are the tenets of the new establishment? I don't try to detail every single one in the paper. I'm just sketching things, but instead, I offer what I take to be two core creeds. Number one, the individual must have complete autonomy from the group, especially groups like the family and the church, when it comes to matters of sex, gender, and procreation. Number two, the findings of the scientific knowledge class and the related preferences of that class in that domain must be imposed on everyone. So just a little word about each of these. As to the first, I won't pause long over constitutional developments in this area involving speech and substantive due process that have sort of valorized expressive individualism and autonomy in matters concerning sex, gender, and procreation. Those have been well documented and are probably familiar to an audience like this one. But beyond those, a vast network of sub-constitutional laws and regulations has emerged, grounded in the various non-discrimination rules that have popped up at all different levels of state and local government. Not only well-known federal laws like Title VII and Title IX and the expanding ways in which these are being interpreted, but state and local healthcare rules, civil rights commissions, and many, many others. Part of what makes these so powerful, I argue in the paper, is that the rules expand so quickly and so unpredictably and with such powerfully ruinous consequences for those that cannot keep pace. And I give some examples of this phenomenon. School boards whose policies now secrete a student's gender transition from students' parents, civil rights commissions that stand ready to bring discrimination complaints against people who fail to use a person's desired pronouns, not just complaints, but punishments, many others. But a truly effective establishment is not going to rely on law alone. It's going to go deeper. The private sector, and especially its moneyed elements, whether big business, healthcare, higher education, media, or others, also uniformly embraces this creed and punishes those who don't. And the examples are numerous, but I'll just mention the case of Professor Kathleen Stock, who describes herself as a supporter of transgender persons, transgender rights, and a feminist, self-described feminist. And yet, because she opposed permitting transgender persons access to certain spaces and activities formerly reserved for biological women, she found herself so vilified by students at her university and other academics around the world that she ended up resigning. She couldn't keep pace with the demands of the new establishment. And if she couldn't, how could others with greater reservations? I'm going to be briefer with what I argue is the second creed, that the findings of science is established by the knowledge class, and the policy preferences of that class, at least in this domain, have to be imposed generally. By the knowledge class, I mean the group that has the power to impose rules in the name of public health and safety derived from an interpretation of scientific findings. The CDC, federal and state and executive actors and public health officials, others empowered to implement policy in response, and here I have in mind, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic. These all form part of the knowledge class. Knowledge class isn't so much a thing as a set of relationships to dispositions about education and culture, characterized generally by an attitude toward what scientific practice and findings suggest to those within the class as sound health policy and responsible civic behavior. And that attitude might be summarized as, when it comes to keeping safe and healthy, obey the knowledge class. In a period of uncertainty, instability, massive tragedy of the sort that has characterized the last 2 years and more, the connection between science as such, pure science, let's say, and the public and private policies implementing what are taken to be the rational conclusions derived from science as such, become more rapidly reached and more morally and politically contestable. Again, the rapidity with which requirements shifted was a measure of one's depth of allegiance to the knowledge class. One striking development, at least to me, was the opposition of science and religion in the ideological lines of division. This is a sort of replaying an intense and bitter microcosm of the enduring conflict between reason and religion, seen at least since the Enlightenment, in which the knowledge class believed that it was defending reason against blind superstition. Those who challenged the knowledge class's rules were accused of irrationally preferring their religion to science, and often enough were portrayed as anti-science Christians or dangerous Christian nationalists with a long history of similar irresponsible resistance. Even the kinds of comparisons thought legally salient during the occupancy restriction fights. How similar to casinos or tattoo parlors are houses of worship? How close do people stand from one another in concert halls and liquor stores as compared to churches? How much spittle is jettisoned in church singing compared to the sporadic speaking in supermarkets? These were all, notice their form, they were all presented as exercises in strictly scientific quantification that masked the qualitative judgments behind them. But how could it be otherwise, I argue in the paper, where the authorities accepted within the establishment must bear the stamp of science. The policies and preferences of that class, as distilled from scientific data, and I say in good faith, for the promotion of what that class believes is the common good, will have to be imposed on dissenting voices. Now, in the second part of the paper, I asked the question, okay, so what? Even if the reader or the audience is willing to go with me this far, why should we care, legally speaking, unless the establishment is a religious establishment? That's what violates the Constitution. So is it religious? That question assumes that we have a handle on what religion is. And in fact, nothing could be farther from the truth. The court has been almost willful in rendering the concept of religion legally incoherent and in promiscuously expanding the idea of religion so much as to render it useless as an analytical tool. And here I agree with the comments of Professor Arcus from yesterday. More important, the is it religious question is now irrelevant because the reach of the new establishment runs deep enough to implicate it in religious controversies. Partisans of the new establishment often dismiss dissenting views as religious, and in this way they embroil the new establishment in religious disagreement. And furthermore, religious belief isn't static. It's not a kind of monolith. It responds to the world in which it's situated. When those who affirm new establishment creeds tell dissenters that their views are religious and in consequence illegitimate or discreditable, well, those dissenters may be forgiven for taking the accusation to heart. Just a few examples of what I mean. I have more in the paper, but I don't have time. In an exchange in the oral argument in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, Justice Sotomayor asked counsel for the state, quote, "How is your interest anything but a religious view? When you say this is the only right that takes away from the state the ability to protect a life, that's a religious view, isn't it?" Close quote. Now, formally, Dobbs is not about religion. It is not a First Amendment case, but practically it is. Justice Sotomayor was portraying the law as religiously motivated and therefore illegitimate. So what matters, the insight that one can draw from this is that what matters is control over the terms of establishment and the terms of objection to it. Religion is just the terminological tool that is deployed to implement the establishment and exclude dissenting positions from it. One more example, in the COVID fights, the descriptive language that objectors were being handed was scientific. To resist was to be lying, it was to be anti-science. But one might get an exemption if one's reasons were religious, namely the kind of reason that one might have if one were not civically minded, health-oriented, and patriotic, but instead irrational, selfish, and retrograde. And so many objectors to the mandates came to understand themselves that way, as combatants in a culture war with a knowledge class, seeking language now labeled religious by that class to express the view that what it means to be an American was being rejected. The somewhat radical conclusion in that part of the paper, a conclusion I should mention at odds with something, a number of positions that I heard yesterday, is we should stop with the "is it religious" question, at least as an academic matter. I understand lawyers will have to ask it for a variety of instrumental reasons. The new establishment is so powerful that it inevitably entangles itself in religious controversy. It takes positions on religion. It assigns religious brands to dissenters. It sets the terms of religious exercise in America. Okay, now, at last, we can discuss the new disestablishments. What are these? But before talking about these, we have to talk about religious exemption. The primary form of legal resistance to the creeds of the new establishment has been thought to be free exercise exemption. And one way to understand rights of exemption is as destabilizing of the establishment, right? There are exceptions. But there's another, and I think a better way to understand exemption, not as establishment destabilizing, but as establishment entrenching. Exemptions are validations of the state's position of dominance in the domains of its control. In cases like Yoder or Thomas versus Review Board, exemption was framed by the court as a concession to cultural oddities and unthreatening subcommunities or individuals that serve only to remind people who is in control. Exemption is an ambiguous instrument of dissent. It can destabilize, but if it's just a sort of string of disaggregated things, it can entrench and validate. Partisans of the new establishment have sensed, rightly, I think, possible dangers represented by forces that use exemption in concert with other doctrines of free exercise to dissent from its orthodoxies. A new establishment is reaffirmed by kind of disaggregated, scattered exemption, but it is far more threatened by systematic resistance. Some champions of exemption have not appreciated this dynamic, maybe because, in my view, they are committed to the new establishment or features of it, and they don't want it to be destabilized. I give a couple examples. Andrew Koppelman has argued that there is a, quote, unnecessary conflict, close quote, between LGBTQ rights and religious liberty, and that legislative compromises can be worked out that would entrench something like the first creed of the new establishment and give dissenters exceptions. Doug Laycock has counseled dissenters from the new establishment to accept their position as losers. Drawing analogies to Catholic resistance to the French Revolution, Laycock warns dissenters, quote, "If you stand in the way of a revolution and lose, there will be consequences," close quote. In my own view, these fights are quite necessary, contra Koppelman, because of the fundamental disagreements motivating them, and because of the threat the dissenters pose to the new establishments. If their exemption wins, can be connected to a larger strategy. They are also necessary because the compromises that scholars like Laycock and Koppelman recommend have been almost instantly outrun by the changing and deepening demands of the new establishment. No compromise was possible because no firm terms of settlement ever existed or will ever exist. And as for revolutions, well, they rarely run unidirectionally. Yes, immediately following the French Revolution, came a kind of intensification in the terror. But there were then ebbs and flows, moments of greater radical vigor and others of reactionary retrenchment. As with revolutions, so too with establishments. What would a strategy of more concerted resistance to the new establishment look like? What would constitute a new disestablishment? Whatever it will be, it's going to be something more than religious exemption. One example might involve, and I offer it tentatively, might involve the recent cases about the question whether states must include religious schools in whatever otherwise neutral or secular educational funding schemes they offer. The Supreme Court has been tending toward the conclusion that they must. In the latest of these cases, Carson versus Mackin, the court is poised, it seems to me, to hold that religious schools must be included in state funding schemes, even when the uses to which monies are being put is programmatically religious. Now, the implications of this line of cases is startling. The momentum for school choice programs is growing, and the court may well nudge it along. All this at a time when public school enrollment, the fall off, may be explained in significant part by an increase in homeschooling and a shift to charter schools and private schools. So together with other doctrines, like the ministerial exception, one can start to see the makings of a new disestablishment coming into view. That is, a combination of free exercise doctrines and others has kind of coalesced to create a possible site for the more systematic, organized, and concentrated expression of dissent to at least some creeds of the new establishment. Now, at least some of these schools, not all of them, some of them don't share new establishment creeds. And if that collection of forces does coalesce, that's a big if at this point, it might represent a kind of pocket of resistance to the new establishment. And I should add, one should very much expect the partisans of the new establishment to jealously police such a development, to use the instruments at their disposal, powerful instruments, including their deep cultural power, to oppose it. Now, I come neither to praise nor condemn these developments. I come to see them clearly for what they are. They are evolving contests over the nature and direction of the new establishment, scope of acceptable dissent within it. And I'd like also, in concluding, to suggest something about the future of religious liberty scholarship held beyond the crouch. Scholars of law and religion should turn away from the kinds of questions that were once asked and continue somehow to be pressed. Questions like, what's the line between religious and secular? What qualifies as a religion? What's special about religion? But is this practice an establishment of religion? How can we describe the views of our community in religiously neutral terms? Those questions assume features of the old American establishment, in which religion had a more definite meaning. They are questions for a different time and a different culture. New questions need to be asked. Questions like, what is the arrangement of legal and cultural power within a polity? And how does that superstructure frame and control dissent? How do establishments change? And what are the mechanisms of that change? How is the category religion deployed strategically by partisans of the establishment and disestablishment? What can dissenters in any regime reasonably expect from the establishment in the way of tolerance of dissent from the establishment's orthodoxies? Asking those questions and others like those, that would orient the field away from the irrelevant concerns of another time and toward the real conflicts that animate our world today. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Geddix.
Well, I too would like to thank Professor Alvarez and the Liberty and Law Center for inviting me here. I was also remarking to Mark during Professor Piccirillo's introduction that it's a sad commentary on the state of affairs when a university brags about its openness to different ideas. I really liked Professor DiGirolami's paper. It made me think about church-state law differently. And, you know, if a paper does only that, it's successful. I also agree that legal scholarship in particular gets trapped in thickets of normativity, and often it's better for us simply to try and describe the situation we're in, however imperfectly that might be. And I think that Mark's description of our current situation as involving a displacement of a soft Christian establishment by a new atomistic, scientific establishment is insightful, and I think helps to explain a number of things. Now, Mark doesn't name this establishment except to call it new, but I think I would call it neoliberalism, with the neo pointing away from classical liberalism and towards Rawlsian liberalism. The central place of individual autonomy in Rawls and his specification of a thin theory of the good leave him no comfortable theoretical space for the formation and nurturing of groups and communities, which are the sites of so much conflict and which, however, we can't do without. And as for religion, those of you who've read Rawls know that he struggles mightily to make his exclusion of religion even-handed. He even adds some secular belief systems to religion and the set of excluded comprehensive doctrines. And he gives believers in public life a temporary reprieve with the so-called proviso, where you can talk authentically religiously in public life, so long as you tacitly agree to supply a secular explanation later. But when the dust clears on Rawls's political liberalism, normal science, secular science, those remain the most comfortable justifications for government and public action, and usually the only permissible ones. As I said, I think the displacement of soft Christianity with neoliberalism is a powerful and elegant explanation of our current constitutional situation. It explains, as Mark mentioned, why during the 90s or the early 2000s, the free exercise clause flipped from a protection of minority religions to an instrument of religions that have historically had significant cultural and political power in the United States, the many Christian denominations. It also explains why liberals and conservatives have changed places with respect to religious exemptions. Conservatives used to detest exemptions as just another form of unrestricted constitutional balancing. This was one of Justice Scalia's themes in Employment Division versus Smith. Employment Division versus Smith, a conservative court is poised to overturn Justice Scalia's signature opinion. Now, of course, religious conservatives can't get enough of judicial strict scrutiny of incidental burdens on religion. And the neoliberals are running as fast as they can away from what used to be a part of the liberal orthodoxy, which was strict scrutiny of incidental burdens on minority religions. And finally, I think perhaps it explains the recent and curious association of religious liberty solely with the right, as if everyone were opposed to it on the left. But if the dominant establishment is neoliberalism, then religious liberty would seem to be owned by conservative religious groups who refuse to secularize in accordance with the new establishment. Now, I'll have more to say than this, and not all of it positive. I wouldn't want to disappoint Mark to have come all the way from Utah and offer only praise. But in keeping with Mark's descriptive orientation, I will also try to avoid normativity in my arguments. And I'll offer three descriptive observations or suggestions or criticisms, I suppose. I think, first, the displacement of the soft Christian establishment by the neoliberal one was less a distinct paradigm shift than a kind of slow dilution or declension from thick Protestant community to where we are now. Second, Mark does not mention race, which I think is embedded in both establishments in complex ways that I can't fully unpack today. But I do want to mention that while they're embedded in complex ways, I think they're embedded in unwoke ways. And And finally, the inability of neoliberalism to make place for community and groups, I think, is both correct and unavoidable in a Western liberal democracy, and perhaps signals the end or the exhaustion of liberal theory. So, okay, from de facto Protestantism to the force. Christianity is really a belated descriptor. It's not accurate until sometime during the 20th century. I think the story begins with hard-edged Protestantism that begins in the aftermath of the Second Great Awakening's rescue of American belief from deism and the Anglican High Church. Mark mentioned a number of these, but you can think of non-sectarianism, so-called non-sectarianism during the 19th century, Bible reading without comment in public schools, the Blaine Amendment, the parochial school funding wars. These were all designed to keep American culture Protestant, not merely Christian, and to exclude Catholicism that would have been included in a genuinely Christian establishment. At some point, of course, Catholics become so numerous and so politically powerful that they can't be kept out. So sometime in the 20th century, perhaps as early as the 1920s, when Al Smith was nominated by the Democrats, the hard-edged Protestant establishment, I think, grudgingly morphed from Protestant to Christian to give Catholics their due. And certainly by the 1980s and the moral majority, the enemies are secularism, Islam, and Eastern religion. They're not Catholicism. Something similar happened to Jews in the post-war era as the enormity of the Holocaust became clear, and once the Red Scares abated, the establishment morphed again from Christian to Judeo-Christian. Will Herberg published Protestant Catholic Jew in 1955. Now, of course, despite this implied invitation, most Jews, though not all, saw church-state issues in a rather more secular light and were happy to participate in the dismantling of the Judeo-Christian establishment, despite the fact that it was now Judeo-Christian, at least from the standpoint of Christians. By the 1990s, I think it all becomes a muddle. There's a brief moment when Abrahamic religions came into vogue in an effort to encompass Muslims, but this is erased almost immediately by 9/11. Justice Scalia, again, gives monotheism a try in McCreary County, one of the Ten Commandments decisions, but it's in a portion of a dissent that no other justice joined, and the monotheistic establishment didn't obtain either constitutional or cultural traction. And then we have the influx of refugee immigrants from Southeast Asia after the United States' withdrawal from Vietnam, the influx of H-1 visa holders from the Indian subcontinent with the rise of the tech industry. That further complicates an already capacious American religious pluralism. How does one enlarge the establishment beyond Judeo-Christianity in response to radical religious pluralism? President Eisenhower was perhaps bizarrely prescient when he declared, famously or infamously declared in the early 1950s, that American government depends on a deep religious faith, and I don't care what it is. The fastest growing group of believers in the United States, if we exclude unbelievers, is the spiritual but not religious, adherence to a kind of loose postmodern deism that is barely distinguishable from neoliberalism. So here we are. May the force be with you, and with you, and you, and you, ad infinitum. So in sum, the shift is less from one paradigm to another than a slow, steady dilution, less a break than a steady declension of a once thick de facto Protestant establishment that, in the face of radical religious pluralism, found itself ultimately with nowhere to go but to neoliberalism. Now, second, I don't think one can talk about the various incarnations of the soft Christian establishment or its neoliberal successor without exploring the influence of race. The same Protestants that were doing battle against Catholic interlopers in the 19th century were simultaneously fighting Mormon polygamy. One had to be monogamous to be truly Christian, truly Republican, and truly white. So the anti-polygamous characterization of Mormons as Black or Asiatic, especially in the writing of Francis Lieber, who was the intellectual leader of that anti-polygamy movement. Martha Ertman has, I think, persuasively shown that anti-polygamous rhetoric identified polygamous Mormon men with a Western stereotype of polygamous Africans and polygamist Asian despots. In a United States that then was overflowing with white supremacy, the most powerful criticism the anti-polygamists could make against the Mormons was that they were not white. Racialized arguments were also deployed against Catholics, against the Irish in the 1840s, against Southern Italians in the later 19th century and early 20th century. Now here I was about to say I'm crawling onto thin ice. Maybe I should say I'm crawling onto thinner ice, given everything that I've already said. But in the 1950s and 60s, after Brown versus Board of Education, conservatives in the southern and border states, and frankly in much of the North, massively resisted Brown, but they also massively resisted the school prayer decisions. Both spurred the formation of Christian academies, and many of these were segregationist, and that I think might be something to explore. With respect to race and the neo-establishment, I'll just defer to Professor Tom Berg at St. Thomas, who has suggested that the court's turn away from the protection of minority religions was influenced by the secularization of the civil rights movement, which was originally and very powerfully theological. Berg wrote this paper more than 20 years ago, so I don't know what he would think or what we should say about Black Lives Matter and other contemporary racial justice movements now. My text here says, here I can be brief, talking about the paradox of groups, and since I've just seen that I have 1 minute left, I will be brief. Liberal theory doesn't have any place for groups. In fact, groups are subversive of liberal theory, subversives of neoliberalism, because to the extent that groups have power, the individuals within them are insulated from the protections of the state that neoliberalism underwrites. This paradox has been the subject of much writing, none of it conclusive, and perhaps it just signals, as I said at the outset, the exhaustion of liberal theory, of neoliberalism. You see the popularity of books like those by Patrick Deneen and others who are trying to look to a post-liberal or something beyond liberalism. With that, I guess I'll just end and say that, again, I really appreciated this paper and the thoughts that it stimulated about our current situation. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Professor Smith.
Thanks. As the other speakers have done, I want to thank the organizers and sponsors of the conference. I've known Helen Alvarez for some time, admired her work and she did make one questionable judgment, though, with respect to this conference, I think. About 2 or 3 months ago, when I was trying to write the paper that I had proposed to write for it, I contacted her and said, Helen, I'm sorry, this paper is just not shaping up, and I think you'd be better off to get someone else to fill my spot. And she persuaded me to go ahead and try to finish it. So here I am, for better or worse, and I hope to make some kind of a contribution. As with the other papers, mine's way too long to read, and I thought, well, maybe I should just explain what's really original about it. And as I tried to think about that, I'm not sure there is actually anything very original about it, but it does involve reading and summarizing and sort of organizing a lot of material that a lot of people have been writing about around a particular theme. And the title that I gave it is The Church in the Twilight. And the Twilight reference comes from Robert Nisbet, the scholar who in the last century observed that civilizations experience twilight ages, in which, as he said, processes of decline and erosion are more evident than those of genesis and development. And he gave some examples from the past. Nisbet listed post-Peloponnesian Athens, Rome of the 1st century BC, and again in the age of St. Augustine, the late Middle Ages. And he said, and he was writing at this time in the 1970s, that the 20th century in the West is a twilight age. So suppose you believe that you are living in such a period. How would that judgment affect your decisions and your priorities? And more specifically, was Nisbet right? Are we in America and in the West in a twilight phase? And if so, what are the implications for our decisions and priorities, and specifically for our thinking about religious freedom? Now, in recent years, Nisbet's assessment has become much more common, I think. There's been a proliferation of diagnoses concluding that American or Western civilization is in a state of decline or decadence or disintegration. This judgment has become actually quite common, as I learned in doing research for this, more than I had realized, and kind of respectable in a sense. So the paper spends quite a bit of time reviewing some of these diagnoses. Some of them come from erudite scholars like Nisbet himself or Jacques Barzoun in his book From Dawn to Decadence. Some come from perceptive pundits, I think, like Ross Douthat in his recent book, The Decadent Society. And some come from just more popular attitudes and perceptions. In a recent book, Mary Eberstadt describes, quote, the omnipresent foreboding of our time, and explains that premonitions of social and political catastrophe abound. In this vein, John Hillen reports that, quote, multiple polls taken with great deliberation over the past decades show a shocking decline in the confidence and trust Americans have in their institutions. This applies across the board: government institutions, commercial institutions, educational institutions, religious institutions, and nonprofits. Hardly any institution has been spared this collapse in trust. These popular perceptions, although less erudite than the work of people like Harold Berman or Barzoun or Nisbet, may be even more ominous because I suggest they can have a self-fulfilling quality. You know, if people come to believe that their civilization is doomed, their expectations may work to bring about that result. Now, the diagnoses of decline differ among themselves. Many of them recently focus on political polarization and paralysis, which these days seem to be debilitating and insuperable problems. So talk of secession and civil war was once confined to a kind of tiny lunatic fringe, but now it's become quite common, even in respectable discourse. Frank Buckley of the faculty here, I think, has a book on secession recently. David French, has an interesting book on secession, and that's becoming quite common. Other critics, though, cite economic factors like slowdowns in economic growth, or a spiraling national debt, or growing inequalities of wealth. Others emphasize cultural factors like disintegrating family life, or declining birth rates, or, in the view of some, uncontrolled immigration, or global military failures, or dehumanizing technology, or environmental factors. Some critics trace our problems to some relatively visible and short-term and perhaps fixable cause, like Donald Trump or Barack Obama, depending on the critic, or Bill Clinton or Newt Gingrich. Others go a little deeper. Mary Eberstadt attributes a lot of our current difficulties to the sexual revolution, and still other observers perceive our malaise as the gradually emerging product of even deeper and more distant philosophical or spiritual causes, like the atheistic humanism of the Enlightenment, or the senility of sensate culture. That's a judgment from Peter M. Sorokin in a book called The Crisis of Our Age that I read and enjoyed. I don't know if enjoy would be quite the right word for it, but as an undergraduate. So I've been thinking about civilizational decline for a long time. But of course, although these diagnoses differ, they don't necessarily contradict each other. It could be that our decadent condition just manifests itself in diverse ways. And there are common themes. One very common assessment connects our decadence to the overextension or the decay of something that we've regarded as one of our proudest achievements, namely our individualism, or our exaltation of the individual human being as the locus of value and meaning. So the paper discusses critiques of individualism, or expressive individualism, as it's sometimes called, by people like Charles Taylor and Robert Bellah. More recently, Carter Sneed and Mary Eberstadt, have books in this vein. And Mark and Fred, were talking a bit about this just now. Western individualism, as it's developed, has both a vertical and a horizontal dimension, I suggest. In its vertical dimension, it attempts to free the sovereign individual from dependence on any higher source, namely God. In its horizontal dimension, it frees the individual from dependence on other human associations like family or community. Robert Bellah, in a classic study, put it this way: the meaning of life for most Americans is to become one's own person, almost to give birth to oneself. It involves breaking free from family, community, and inherited ideas. Now, Western individualism, it's a complicated thing, I think, because we do associate it with values that most of us cherish, like freedom or authenticity, human dignity, equal concern and respect. But pushed to its extremes, it's also linked to various modern maladies, like a loss of meaning, increasing rates of depression and suicide, identity politics, and more generally with what observers on both the right and the left lament as a loss of community. There's a lot of discussion, as probably everyone knows, about this, the problem of a loss of community, and frequent pleas from various directions for renewed or stronger communities. But the pleas don't seem to make much headway. And this isn't really surprising because they are in tension with the commitment to individualism. In the sense, and as Mark said, he didn't have much time to elaborate. Fred was talking about that a little bit, I think, right at the end of his remarks. That is, the community's in tension with a strong commitment to individual authenticity, which sort of goes the other way. So 2 years ago, on the 20th anniversary of his much discussed book, Bowling Alone, Robert Putnam issued a revised edition, and in it he said this, quote, "My purpose in writing the book was to try to contribute to a revival of American community," as the subtitle of Bowling Alone signaled. It is now perfectly plain that in that sense I have failed. The data shows unequivocally how thoroughly America has continued to regress in the intervening 20 years, a downward plunge resulting not merely in fraying community ties, but also in worsening economic inequality, greater political polarization, and more cultural individualism. So these kinds of analyses lead to verdicts of decadence or disintegration. To borrow from the historian Arnold Toynbee, whom I discuss a bit in the paper also, America and the West seem to be experiencing a schism in the body social and a schism in the soul. So in this situation then, what are our options? What should we do? And I discussed what seem to be like three general strategies or responses that we might adopt. First one I call drift, or just resignation. We might just go on living our lives as well as we can, do our best with the day-to-day problems we face, without any expectation that we have much control over our understanding of the long-term trajectory. Or if that seems too passive, we might adopt a second strategy. I call it meliorism. Exert ourselves to figure out what needs to be fixed and then fix it. And this sort of a strategy, I think, can come in either conservative or liberal varieties. So we can make America great again or build back better. In a sense, these are just different versions of a kind of meliorism strategy. Or if we come to despair of being able to succeed in that kind of strategy, a third possibility would be, I call it like a bunker strategy, or a fortress strategy, or a Noah's Ark strategy. In other words, in this vein, we would acknowledge that we're living in a twilight age, as Nisbet said, that we can't seem to fix things. We also can't seem to foresee or control what the age we're moving into will look like. So we might try to construct bunkers or fortresses or Noah's Arks, and then attempt to gather up the fragments, so to speak, or gather and protect those features of the old order that seem particularly valuable, guarding and preserving them so that they can be brought out and reasserted in the unenvisionable future that will eventually emerge. Now, these are different strategies and they reflect really different attitudes. And I do think that a lot of people, and Christians in particular, think that they're facing a choice among these strategies, a kind of fight or flight sort of choice. But I suggest we don't necessarily have to choose between them. We might try to pursue, for example, a meliorism strategy, to fix things as well as we can, while also constructing bunkers as a fallback in case our primary efforts fail. And these strategies might even complement each other because a fortress can serve both offensive and defensive purposes. Okay, so now what about religious freedom? So I've argued elsewhere that, religious freedom, I think a lot of people would understand, has kind of individualist dimension, and it also has institutional dimensions. I've argued elsewhere that the institutional dimension actually, chronologically at least, is kind of prior, that freedom of the church was, the older struggle, and very roughly, the chronology would go, a fight for freedom of the church, mostly Protestant understanding at some point that the individual conscience was serving the role that the church, had once served as the primary site of the interaction between individual human beings and God, so that the freedom of the church gets transferred into something like the freedom of the internal church of conscience, and then that becomes a commitment to a more individualist view of religious freedom. But whatever the chronology is, I think for most of American history, we have thought about religious freedom mostly in individualist terms. Religious freedom and freedom of the individual conscience have been almost interchangeable concepts, and the paper discusses how this was true for Madison and Jefferson and how it remains true for much of modern constitutional jurisprudence. Institutional freedom has been in our jurisprudence kind of a secondary and derivative theme, a sort of neglected stepchild. In an article that he wrote when he and I were both children, Jerry Bradley wrote, church autonomy should be the flagship issue of church and state, the litmus test of a regime's commitment to genuine spiritual freedom. Instead, it is the least developed, most confused of our church-state analyses, both in the law and in informed commentary. And I think that Jerry was right about that. There's been a lot of uncertainty about where institutional freedom even comes from. How's it grounded in the Constitution? Is it really individual freedom that the Constitution protects, with institutional freedom being kind of like a corollary, that might emerge from that? A lot of uncertainty about that. Actually, what could be one of the strongest sort of rhetorically sort of supports for institutional religious freedom would be Jefferson's legendary wall of separation notice between church and state. But in modern discourse, almost invariably, that gets transformed into a separation between government and religion. So the result is that the secularists are the people who tend to want to invoke the metaphor most often, and people on the sort of more religious side of things usually want to resist it. That's not an accurate statement of our jurisprudence. So it doesn't seem to work to do what it might actually do. And this individualist emphasis isn't really surprising because it's completely in sync with the individualist emphasis of modernity. But the neglect of institutional religious freedom has, I think, recently begun to change. There's been promising scholarship on freedom of the church. Jerry's own article was, I think, a sort of a leader in this, and Rick Garnett and others have been doing work in these veins. And the Hosanna Tabor decision, I think, has been sort of like a major jurisprudential sort of achievement in this respect. And if the diagnosis that I have outlined is correct, this change, I think, needs to happen. Institutional religious freedom needs to be seen as important as, maybe even more important than, individual religious freedom. And that's because, I suggest, the church or religious communities and institutions are actually the best candidates to serve as fortresses or Noah's Arks in a decadent or declining civilization. That's because the church is the institution, I think, best situated to address both the horizontal and the vertical aspects of the individualism that, overextended, is an underlying feature, I think, of much of our decline. In this respect, I think Elizabeth Clark's presentation from yesterday, I haven't read her paper yet, I look forward to doing that, but would be addressing, I think, this sort of possibility. In Wisconsin against Yoder, the Amish case, the Supreme Court observed that in the Middle Ages, important values of the civilization of the Western world were preserved by members of religious orders who isolated themselves from all worldly influences against great obstacles. We may be, as Alistair McIntyre and Jane Jacobs and others say, facing sort of a new dark age, and we can hope that religious orders or churches might serve a similar function today. But this prospect does raise some serious challenges, and in the paper I discussed 3 of them. First, many of the churches today, I think, have themselves absorbed the same values and assumptions that seem to be the root of our conditions of decadence today. Quote Mary Eberstadt again, "If the answer were only a matter of going back to church, The problem is that most Americans' idea of Christianity has been watered down by radical individualism and a consumerist mentality, just sort of reproducing the same kinds of commitments. So they're the source of the problem. So that's one challenge. Second, there's a great deal of work to do in fashioning the substantive content of freedom of the church. This, I think, is the kind of thing that Martin Nussbaum was talking about yesterday in his comments. And this, I think, is a work that is never really finished and probably never can be, because there isn't really, I think, any precise, like Platonic ideal of the exact meaning of freedom of the church. It's always been something that's been worked out and negotiated in different historical contexts with whatever the powers that be might be. So this will be an ongoing challenge, I think. Third, and this may be the most daunting, there's the challenge of justifying, under current conditions, a commitment to freedom of the church or to institutional religious autonomy. This is especially daunting, I think, because, well, in past ages, this kind of challenge could take a different shape. These issues were debated basically in past centuries within a sort of Christian framework that even the ruling powers were, at least in name, committed to, so they could be discussed in that way. That's not true today. So the problem of justification is harder. I'll quote Jerry once again. He says, what we call church state arises and can only be discussed within an intellectual field that presupposes religious, particularly Christian concepts. Now, that's a very plausible thing to say, I think. I hope myself that Jerry's not completely right about that, because if he is, the task would seem kind of hopeless, let's say, under current circumstances. So I wouldn't be quite so categorical. And I have myself begun to try to outline in different places justifications based on currently acceptable modes of justification, like original meaning or contractarian type justifications. But I have no great confidence in the power of any of my efforts to actually be very persuasive. But I think others are working on this sort of thing as well. And again, recent Supreme Court decisions in this vein are at least somewhat helpful. They do seem to be acknowledging something like this. Even so, it is an uphill battle, and the outcome is uncertain. So if you were a betting person, and given all of these daunting challenges, the prospect that the church might serve as some sort of Noah's Ark, preserving what's valuable in a declining civilization, is probably not one you would want to bet on, at least if you consider the question from a purely human perspective. But believers have a different source of hope, namely the ancient promise that the church will endure and that not even the gates of hell will prevail against it. And for some of us, that's a sufficient reason to persist in the struggle. Thanks.
Mr. Graham.
All right, well, thank you everyone for having me here. Thank you, Helen. I should say, first of all, that it's a true pleasure and privilege to be here. I've received a much more hospitable and friendly welcome here than my colleague Kristen Wagner recently received at Yale. If I was supreme dictator for a day, I would send all of those Yale students here for manners training. But thank you again for having me. It's great to be here. All right, a couple points. I really enjoyed reading Steve's paper. It took me back to many of the things I studied in graduate school. It covers classical history, medieval history, historiography, political theory, constitutional law. It is vast in scope and fun to read, so I commend the paper to you. A couple points I would like to make in the spirit of beyond defensive crouch. I'm going to swing for the fences here, and I'll leave it up to you to decide whether I actually hit the ball or not. So in responding to the first point about civilizational decay, the old quip about, there are so many bad things going on today. We see them going on all the time. It just reminds me of they seem to prove out the Calvinist version of history, which is that it's just one damned thing after another. Now, having said that, I'm a little suspicious of the decline theory or decay theory. There have been people who have been forecasting the decline of Western civilization since the beginning of Western civilization. And may I even say, for those of you who have a classics background, good old Hesiod in Theogony and Work and Days is portending that he lived in the Iron Age because the Gold Age and the Silver Age and the Bronze Age had already passed. So there are prophets of decay in every age. I'm a little suspicious of that, despite the fact there are very real and permanent problems around us. I would also say, Steve goes into a lot of the historiography regarding kind of early Christianity, fall of the Roman Empire. He didn't talk about Edward Gibbon in his paper, but Gibbon plays in pretty prominently at places. And I would say, just noting the historiography, recent history and recent scholarship has really almost rejected the decline and fall thesis. I'm speaking and thinking particularly of the work of Peter Brown at Princeton and all of his students who've really advanced the message. There really wasn't a true dark ages. In fact, all medieval historians now actually reject the term dark ages, and they refer to the world of late antiquity, or they refer to the early Middle Ages. But that whole idea of a paradigm of decay and fall has really been challenged. And there have been some pushbacks against Peter and his writings, but I think I would refer them to Steve to consider with regard to, is decline and fall, decay the right terminology to be using? So one of the things I would say with regard to the relationship between church and state is one area where I think we've really done a poor job as the church of rendering too much unto Caesar is with regard to how we handle our affairs with regard to church law and church corporations. I'm thinking specifically of most churches, or churches often, are incorporated under state law. That means they have the same fiduciary duties as every other state law corporation, every other nonprofit corporation. I think we need to be very careful about that. We've kind of just accepted that as normal. But if we're talking about the freedom of the church, we need to make plain, even if we are going to file articles of incorporation, that the church is not a creature of positive law. We do not exist at the pleasure of a political sovereign. We exist way before America ever existed, and dare I say, the church will exist as an entity until, very far into history, well beyond the United States itself. The Catholic Church is the most durable institution in the history of the world. And I think that's true from a theological sense, but it's also true from a historical and experiential sense. Even through all of its many, many ups and downs, I think it's fair to say the church can survive really any political calamity, and I can say that based upon 2,000 years of history. So we need to be thinking very carefully about these articles of incorporation I mentioned. I think when we file them, we should almost include language that says we're filing this not because we have to, but as a matter of comity, not a matter of obligation, but as a matter of, we just want to be good neighbors. So we're going to go ahead and file these documents. But we're talking about the idea of, yesterday, religion as special. If we want to really make the argument that religion is special, we need to do it not just through our kind of metaphysical arguments about what religion is, but also by the very practical things that we can do to reserve our rights, as it were, in the corporate context. I think, every lawyer knows that you lose rights you don't assert. Here, we need to be saying in these articles, again, we don't exist. We're not filing this document because the state tells us we have to. And also, we need to be thinking very carefully about whether we've sort of made a deal with the devil, if you will, because we seem to have traded state law duties for tax benefits for our parishioners, right? Maybe we need to wean ourselves off the fact that you get a tax write-off for a charitable donation to a church in order to achieve greater autonomy. It's almost a parallel between many Christian universities who get saddled with additional obligations because they take money from the federal government. Maybe we need to do something for the church like Hillsdale and Grove City do, which is, we don't need your tax exemption, so we are going to assert our own institutional autonomy by telling you that we don't really need your favor. Thank you very much. One other thing, talking about the bunker mentality and the ameliorative mentalities that Steve mentions, I would say I am very, very dubious that the church is going to be a torchbearer for Western civilization in any meaningful way. It pains me to say that, but I really think the best place for that right now is in the classical Christian school movement. They are very serious about reading classics. They are very serious about Christian faith. I think we all should want our students to be reading Plato as well as Paul and be reading John Locke in addition to Jonathan Edwards. And I think that's the only institution that I am currently, or movement that I'm currently aware of, that is trying to integrate in a very serious way really the highest ideals of both the classical tradition and all of its values, and also the Christian tradition and how they've worked themselves out in synthesis, all the way from classical antiquity to the modern day. So I think one subversive thing that we should be doing, those of us who are religious, is putting our students, our kids, really in organizations that actually share our values. In fact, it's very subversive, but I would say that if you are a religious person, you should think really hard and long about sending your kids to public schools these days. I do not think the quality of education is excellent, but beyond that, you cannot undo at the dinner table what 40 hours of indoctrination do every week. So I would consider that one of our options. Again, I'm not sanguine the church can do it, but I am very optimistic that classical Christian schools can do a very good deed for our country. So this is one other hot sports opinion, which is, we've talked a lot about kind of changing frameworks. I'm going to raise an argument here, and because it's one that's near and dear to my heart, but we social conservatives need to link economic liberty and religious liberty together. There are people who care about economic liberty who really don't care about religious liberty. But if we can make the case those two things exist in harmony and complement each other, we can win new friends to our cause. And here I'm thinking really about a classical liberals' interpretation of a case like Masterpiece Cake Shop. For example, these anti-discriminatory regimes that exist all over the country in various forms, they really don't make sense anymore. Let's assume they made sense in 1964. Granted, I'll grant you that. Today, I don't think so. Why? Because we have universally competitive markets. And I would refer you to the Law and Economics brief filed by Richard Epstein and some of my friends at the Mont Pelerin Society, of which I'm a member, in that case, which essentially shows there are 20 bake shops within a few miles where you can get the exact same product. The idea that there's a readily available alternative to the service, and being a member of a pluralistic society, you should be able to say no thank you based upon sincerely held religious convictions, especially when the exact same product is on offer just a few miles away and people are very happy to provide it. I think it's a very minimal concession, and having an entire discriminatory regime and law that punishes people when under those circumstances, to me, is no longer reasonable. All right, I've also heard a little bit about, Fred mentioned neoliberalism. That is something that is a concept, a word that I don't really like very much. It's generally used derisively for people like me who love Friedrich von Hayek and Ludwig von Mises and things like that, and who love Austrian economics. We prefer classical liberal, or just flat out liberal in the old school European sense of a free society, not MSNBC liberalism, big government liberalism. But I'd like to reclaim the word liberal for those of us who want a free society. All right, so in addition to that, I would just say one of the best things that I have found to help advance the cause for religious freedom has nothing to do with law. It has everything to do with literature. And I have found, speaking to adults and speaking to children, that the way to actually get them to understand the idea is important is to introduce them to a great text like Antigone when they are very young. They seem to understand through the literary experience what is very hard to argue about when we bring it modern day. It makes the point in a way that we should be making the point. I've talked about this text with many adults. In fact, you may know, even to this day, the Aspen Institute uses Antigone as one of their core texts. I've been to many Aspen Institute events, and it's provided some of the best conversations I've ever had about religious freedom with people who really, we don't get along much, or we don't really have a lot in common, I should say. We get along fine, but it's very important to be able to talk to people. And I find like that is a wonderful way to introduce people to a very hot topic in a very unthreatening and unassuming sort of way. It's a very compelling story. If you haven't read it, I highly encourage you to read it or read it again. And with that, I think I'm going to end a few minutes early and maybe leave a little more time for questions.
Thank you all for your comments. This has been really thought-provoking, and so I definitely want to give each of you a chance to respond. I'll start at the end with Professor DiGirolamo.
Thanks very much. I don't have much in the way of response other than just, to note something that I didn't note in my initial comments, which is that I'm extremely honored to be on this particular panel. So we've just met, and Joanne also, but these two guys to my left, these sort of grand, may I say, older men of law and religion, it's a real pleasure for me to sit and to listen to them, and certainly to have Fred Geddick's comment on my piece. And I have to say, just sort of quickly, I kind of agree with everything he said. Even on the critical side, I think that the point about describing, or I should at least say this, I think I can take on board to modify or soften or complicate all three of these claims. The claim about the slide versus the flat out active change or single change, I think is correct, although I think you could describe it in a combination of ways, let's say. That's certainly true. The point about race, I thought I was being controversial enough, and maybe I'll add that too. Okay, so yes, I understand. I'll try to. I think some of the points that he makes about on that front are strong, and certainly the final point that I think links up a little bit with Steve's paper about the issue of groups is implicit and needs to come out more with, at least with respect to the first what I'm calling the first creed of the new establishment, that is to say, individualism versus group authority. So anyways, I'm grateful for the comments and interested and delighted to hear more thoughts and criticisms.
Great, thank you. Professor Geddick?
I'll just defer to Steve and Andrew.
Okay.
I don't need to say any more.
Okay. Professor Smith?
Yeah, well, a lot of points have come up that are worth talking about, but I think I'll just mention one because it's sort of, there's a similar point, I think, on both sides, of the comments on both sides of our presentation this morning. That is, so all of us have been talking, I guess, about historical interpretation in one way or another. Mark and Fred were talking about interpreting the development in America, and Mark has more of a binary, you might almost say, there was the old establishment and there's the new establishment, and Fred wants to change that into just, no, there's just a declension of the old establishment and so forth. And I've been talking about decline and so forth, and Andrew points out that although it's long been thought, that Rome fell, and everybody talks about the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, and Gibbon, wrote under that title, that Peter Brown and others interpret it more as a kind of continuity. And so, this sort of historical interpretation always involves, it's somewhat speculative, it involves interpretation, you can emphasize different things. But it doesn't mean that sometimes one characterization isn't more useful or a little more accurate or something for other purposes. So I think with the older one, Rome, I would just say that although the work of somebody like Peter Brown is amazing, so good, and a useful antidote to there was ancient civilization and then the Dark Ages, nonetheless, there have been some responses to that. So if you just look at terms of things like literacy or urbanization or transportation or all kinds of things, there was a huge change, that really could be described as a collapse. Again, just calling it then Dark Ages for the next 1,000 years is ridiculously oversimplified. But I still think that not only Rome, but other situations can accurately be described as collapsing or declining and so forth. There's always going to be some continuity, but sometimes that's not the most perspicuous sort of description. With respect to the same kind of question between Mark and Fred, I guess I'm going to side a little with Mark on that one. I think what Fred described is true. There has been definitely a softening of what used to be a more Protestant establishment and so forth. But I don't think it quite captures what's happened or the real issues that we face to say there's just been a decline of that kind of Christianity, or to say, for that matter, that what's coming now is neoliberalism of a Rawlsian type. I'd feel much more comfortable if I thought that were an accurate description, just Rawls with still plenty of respect for other people and freedom of speech and freedom of religion, I'm not a big fan of Rawls, but I mean, that would be something that you could be much more comfortable living with. So I think it's something a little different. A new establishment captures it a little better, just as one sort of, so T.S. Eliot, had this sort of famous lecture and book that he gave back in the late 1930s, in which he said the future of the West will be determined by a contest between Christianity and paganism. And that's sort of a jarring characterization. So I did a book on that about 4 years ago called Pagans and Christians in the City, trying to develop that kind of what paganism might mean and so forth. But I think whether you want to use the term paganism or whatever, it's important to recognize that it is a competition between potentially aggressive religiosities, not just a softening, I think, of one sort of thing into something more, whatever, bland and namby-pamby. I think, and I think that's important in appreciating the situation that we're in, that there is a real Robbie George says something like the clash of orthodoxies. It is a clash of orthodoxies. It's not just a softening, I think, of the Christian establishment.
Go ahead.
No, I guess I would say, I think I've seen a rise in illiberalism on the right and the left, and that has troubled me greatly. I think there are younger conservatives who seem increasingly attracted to using state power for reasons that classical liberals would find very uncomfortable. And I think that's, on my own side of the fence, kind of a disturbing trend. I would actually like to see, a reclaiming of the term liberalism. I could definitely live with a Rawlsian establishment if that was on offer. I don't think it's on offer. I think more than anything, we're seeing, new orthodoxies that have, every bit as creedal as, any church orthodoxy, and dissent is punished severely. So liberalism, I'd like to see it make a comeback, if anything. So anyway, maybe you can help me in that project, because it's going to be, it's very hard to convince young people these days that government is not the answer. And government can solve virtually any problem. It almost has salvific qualities. And for someone who wants to live in a free and open society, I don't really want to give the government that much power.
Thank you. I am going to open it up to audience questions. And I see one coming, so.
Yeah, hi, David Bernstein again. It's a pleasure to see people here, people who I've read, whose work I've been reading for many years, some of whom I've only met once or barely or not at all, and learn how to pronounce Mark's name, although I'm not going to try it right now in public. I want to push back a little bit on Fred, and I guess Mark too, since he said he agreed on the issue of whether the current establishment is against groups at all, because it's true that they're hostile to certain kinds of group formation, including religious groups. So if you were going to go to one such person and say, from the establishment, and say, oh, I'm the head of the Christian Legal Society, or whatever Christian group you might have at a university, they might treat you with some skepticism or even hostility. But these same individuals are, in their establishment capacity, perfectly not just content, but happy to promote the Africana House and the Latinx House and other such organizations, which are all group and identity based, and really have, frankly, from a liberal point of view, far less reason for existing, right, than religious organizations. So it's a certain type of organization. And just on a related note, I've been visiting colleges with my high school junior daughter, and they have these student-led tours and admissions counselor presentations. And so far, on the 8 or 9 tours I've been to, no one has asked about religious life at the universities, but 3 or 4 students have asked about what sort of resources and communal organizations and safe spaces, one person even put it in those terms, are there available for students of color. And actually the most sort of sociologically interesting aspect of that to me is that each of the students who asked that question were Asian. And I got the sense that because their status as being official people of color is in question. That the question was really less about people of color in general, is do you accept Asians as a valid identity or not, given the Rhodes controversy. But in any event, the broader point that is not only tolerated but welcomed, whereas other forms of more traditional identity are discouraged. I think, I'd like to hear your response to that. Doesn't seem to jive with the idea that groups per se are disfavored.
You're going to back me up, right? Well, there are at least two ways to think about groups. I mean, one way is they're aggregations of individuals. They're voluntary associations. And a voluntary association, like a bowling club, to invoke Putnam, those exist to protect individuals. They're not organic institutions by themselves. I mean, I was struck by Andrew's description of the Catholic Church, or the church, that it's existed, for 2 millennia. That's it. There's a way of thinking about groups in which they're more than aggregations of individuals, that they have their own organic status and existence. We're used to flying at 50,000 feet, and you've asked a 5,000-foot question. But my working hypothesis would be that the sorts of groups you describe, some at universities and so on, aren't so much organic groups but they're aggregations of individuals and really just manifestations of individuals. I mean, that would be my working hypothesis. Actually, voluntary associations, that's kind of, gosh, I think I probably offended Protestants 4 or 5 times in my talk, but that's a very Protestant idea. You don't like this church, just go down the street and join another one. Latter-day Saints don't think that way. Catholics tend not to think that way. Jews certainly, I mean, the world does not let Jews think that way. And, really thick communities form identities because the groups are something more than just the aggregations of individuals. So that's the best I can do.
I must, given what you just said, tell a joke, which is a Jewish man is shipwrecked, like Robinson Crusoe, on a deserted island, and when they find him 10 years later, he gives a tour to the rescuers, and they see there are 2 synagogues there, and they say, well, while you're one person, why do you need 2 synagogues? He said, well, that's the one I pray in, and that's the one I would never set foot in.
Well, I want to. I can't really follow that, but I will tell another story. This is not a joke. This is a real one. It's a story about the late law professor Lino Graglia. When I was just a baby law prof, I was able to hear a talk that he gave, and we went out to dinner, and we were talking about we're both Roman Catholic, and we're both from Italian backgrounds, and he said, well, I've got my background is one where I was born and raised, I'm a cradle Catholic, and then I went away to college, and then when I came back, I said, Mom, Dad, I'm no longer a Catholic. And they said, what are you talking about? You're always going to be a Catholic. But Mom, Dad, I don't believe, I don't choose that any longer. And they just sort of scratched their heads and said, I just don't understand what you're talking about. So time went on, and he got married and had kids and came back to the church, right? He rejoined and he came back to his parents. He says, Mom, Dad, I'm back, right? I've rechosen, right? I'm coming back into the fold. And what are you talking about? You've always been here. So I do think that and this is sort of the way that I put it in the paper, it's it's the authority of the individual to choose in matters of, example that I gave was sex and gender and procreation, but it could be in other sorts of matters, right? In other sorts of identitarian matters, that I am the chooser rather than that it's the group that forms me, that imposes itself on me and that binds me to it, might be a way to get at the question that Professor Bernstein is asking and maybe aligns with what Fred has said.
Thank you. Professor Albury, you have a question?
Thanks. Yeah, a couple of thoughts that complicate a little what Fred and Steve had said in particular. One is with regard to the decline thesis, there's some interesting survey data. Frank Newport, who does religion surveying for Gallup, who says, listen, people just weren't free to say, I'm a seeker, I'm spiritual but not religious. And they just didn't say so much. The fact that it's being measured now is more a sign of their feeling that they can still be accepted when they say it versus a real measure of falling away. A theologian that I'll be talking about in my paper, Luigi Giussani, would observe in Italy in the 50s, look at the 1 million little girls in veils parading into this church for the ceremony, but it's an inch deep. And one of the things you see about surveys of people who are in churches now is that they're far more intensely committed. So there's fewer, but more intense commitment. I find that interesting. The other thing I think complicates things a little is, on the family stuff, on the one hand, we can look at the data about less marriage, less marital parenting, more divorce, more cohabitation, later marriage, et cetera. But then you actually look at people, and again, it's when they're a little older, when Leo Graglia got married and had kids, people's allegiances are very firmly to their family bonds. And they're constructing them differently. Cohabitations don't tend to last. I don't think that's one of the new constructs, but they're still looking for permanence. They still know when cohabitation tips into marriage, it's often because they have a child and they think, okay, now I totally need you around. I remember having that feeling, not when I had a girl, but when I had a boy. I remember turning to my husband in the delivery room and saying, now you may never leave, because I don't know what I'm doing. And then, within marriage, more equal regard, more fair sharing of things. So I just want to point out some of the positive things within these communities. They sort of, yes, it's an individual choice, but the choice then sort of adheres to something that's sort of a universal attachment. And then another question I had, I guess, Fred, I wasn't perfectly clear regarding the discussion about race and how it interacted with Mark's paper. I'm sorry, I didn't quite get the point. What occurred to me, rather than as a religious freedom or a one or another kind of establishment question, is it's so much a socioeconomic issue now today. And of course, I teach family law, and to a carpenter, everything is a nail, but family is a huge aspect of the socioeconomic differences in race, in ethnic groups. And I wondered if, with regard to that, it's not so much a religious divide as it is a continuing socioeconomic divide. Yes, there's definitely still racial prejudice, but I wonder, if this divide does not have a relationship any longer to religion, or if you think it does. So those are just a couple of thoughts there.
Who would like to take a stab at that?
Well, I'll take the second question and leave the first one for Steve and Mark. But just in terms of race, my point only was that especially 19th century, early 20th century Christianity was tied up with race as religion. And so to talk about that soft establishment without mentioning race, I thought was a deficiency. Now I don't think everything is race. And I certainly would take your point that nowadays, when I personally, racism doesn't seem to have disappeared, but, we no longer live in the 1950s or the 1920s or the 1870s, and that, socioeconomics may well be a more important discriminator than race in family law and other areas.
And I am going to ask that you try to keep the comments a little short because we have some more questions to get to as well, and are running a little bit short on time.
I'll pass.
Oh. Sorry, I didn't mean to dissuade you from speaking. I just was asking that you.
I agreed basically with what was said.
Okay.
So I don't have-
And then I think you were next, sir.
My question is for Mr. Graham. It's got two parts. One is, from your perspective, running a religious liberty organization, what are the practical places we might be pinched economically as social conservatives and religious people? And two is, what can we do about that legally? There doesn't seem to be a political will to talk about or legislate on economic issues. And speaking from a litigation standpoint, the rational basis test is very difficult to win under.
Yeah, let me just address that quickly, and I'll address it philosophically. I think this isn't going to respond to your practical question, but it's going to help in terms of, as long as we think of liberty as indivisible, I think we should think of it as indivisible: economic, political, and religious. I think those three things go together like the proverbial three legs of the stool. I think anytime any one of them is diminished, the others are diminished, and the stool can potentially flop over. I do think there is some correlation, not causation, but correlation between the rise in interest in economic collectivity or collectivism and a decline in the interest in religious freedom.
Thank you. We still have a couple minutes, and I'm actually probably going to take organizer's privilege by making sure we get to the both remaining questions. Professor Bradley?
Oh, I rejoice to say I haven't forgot my question. And I bring that up because I'm grateful to Mark. I thought the whole thing was terrific, really, both in content and as an example of good scholarly exchange. But I thank Mark for not naming me.
Please?
I'm sorry.
Thank you. There's just for the people online.
I should do like a Steve Smith imitation. Okay.
We tall people, you know.
Yeah, we tall guys, us big guys. But I want to thank Mark at least for not naming me as one of the other old men of church-state law. But frankly, by force of logic, I have to plead guilty, because if Fred and Steve are old men, and Steve and I were both writing as children, ergo, I'm an old man too. But I haven't forgotten my question, as old people are wont to do. But it is this, and it's on a diagnostic side of things, and I want to see if we have to file a bill of particulars against Christianity itself in the following respect, and all too briefly. It seems to me that maybe the most striking thing about the New Testament is its almost spectacular individuality, that each one of us is going to be judged at the end of our days, and that both in Madison's Memorial Remonstrance, Dignitatis Humanae, and every place in between, you have this kind of radical accountability of each one to the truth, even to the point of converting, leaving behind one's mother's brother, sister, father. So that's what I mean by the radical individuality of Christianity. It seems to me that Christianity further disenchants nature, and despite people's tendency perhaps to associate religion and Christianity with superstition, Christianity slays superstition. I am the Lord thy God. There's only one God. So Christian God monopolizes the supernatural. And I think because of all of that, you really have a hard time getting from a kind of Christian society to a kind of totalitarian society, that if you're a Christian society, you have a very difficult time in coming to worship the folk, the people, the nation. So that's all a long-winded way of saying that, yeah, well, that's a real gamble. So if you have a Christian society, there's a lot riding upon there being a greater than human source of meaning and value, and that would be God. But when that society secularizes and God is practically speaking absent, I think it's a straight shot to the mystery passage, and I think that's kind of where we are.
Yeah, good point. I agree.
Yes, I think it's a nice point also, and it somewhat puts in question the opposition that I set up in the paper to describe it, to offer a different description as a transmutation, or let's say what Steve has described as a kind of heresy of the initial Christian dispensation. Now I will say, to describe Christianity that's complicated, right? There's a lot in there, and it may be that later formulations could be different than the way that you just put those 2 points. But nevertheless, I think that's also a kind of plausible story to tell, and the idea of something outside, something transcendent. Well, I think this is something. I'll toss it down to folks, because Steve has talked about this a lot in his work.
Yeah, I'll just say real quickly that I mentioned in my remarks here that different people give different diagnoses, and some just Donald Trump, and some it's the sexual revolution, but some go much deeper. And if I were going to give one, it would be more along the lines of the sort of the sort of, I don't know what the right term would be, but the distancing of God from public life and so forth. If I were to point to a single thing that I think is the source of that, I think that would be it. So.
And we're going to just squeeze in this last question. So go ahead.
Hi, my name is Dylan Sparks, and my question is for Mr. Graham. So I believe that now we see a resurgence. Oh, you need me to move the mic? So I believe that now we see a resurgence among parents trying to take back control of education. We see a lot of Americans questioning the assumptions of our political order. And speaking from my own experience, I knew a lot of people in college who weren't really exposed to the classics, but they were willing to say there's something wrong with our society and we need a new course. But with that being said, we do see some big disadvantages. I think a key one is that we don't have classical education in schools. We have a public school model that's more so designed to teach people to conform, to memorize, instead of to actually be civically active and to critically think. And then I think another thing that you mentioned too is that we don't really have a comprehensive conservative ideology. So with that being said, what do you think are some key ways that we can solidify a truly liberal movement and not waste this moment in history?
Wow, do you have an hour? Yeah, just quickly, because time is short. Bill Buckley was a master fusionist, right? He gets together the 3 legs of the stool, 1955, puts National Review together. It's the anti-communists, it's the economic conservatives or neoliberals, and the traditionalist conservatives. I don't see those groups doing much together anymore, right? And there are some deep divides between those groups now that really have come out in the post-war era. But there needs to be a new fusionism that comes together where people we can be co-belligerents on single issues together, even if we're not aligned on everything. And for example, I can be a radical co-belligerent with a radical feminist on the issue of pornography, and we should be willing to form those sorts of alliances.
Well, thank you all. We will take a 15-minute break, and there are refreshments across the hall. So if you go out the front door and go straight across the hall, there are refreshments there.
Oh, like we did yesterday.
Yeah.
Yes, so eat quick.
I love your paper.